Hey everyone, it's Sean from Crafted Elements. In this video, I want to talk about the state of epoxy resin, the applications of epoxy resin. I'm going to give you some epoxy resin primers, and I'm going to do a quick project to demonstrate some cool stuff that you can do with resin. If you are not familiar with our company, Crafted Elements is the largest provider of large format, very thick woodworking molds for woodworkers, makers, resin artists. Basically, we don't do like the smaller kind of, I don't want to say trinkety molds, but smaller project molds. We do very large, thick, wide format molds for making bigger pieces, as well as kind of higher volume production applications. The other thing we do is router templates. So we have an entire line of router templates to help you shape wood with your router. We have router jigs, we've got router bases. We've even got something called a router sled, which is essentially a dumb CNC machine that you operate with your hands or your arms to level slabs and tabletops and things like that. So if you aren't familiar with your company and you're interested in doing epoxy resin work or small woodworking projects, check out craftedelements.com because I guarantee you'll find some cool stuff there. What I actually want to talk about first before I get into a project though is the state of epoxy resin. We've been around since 2019 making our products for fine people like you, but a lot of things have changed, trends have kind of come and gone. And one of the things that I used to see, and I kind of still see a little bit, is, oh, epoxy resin is a trend, or you get the environmentalist, anti-plastic people saying, oh my God, epoxy resin, when are we gonna see more of that crap? You got the old school woodworkers saying, epoxy resin isn't woodwork, all this kind of stuff. But I want to give you my opinion as someone who's kind of in this industry, who works with a lot of vendors, who works with a lot of people that are doing things like this, and who's actually a data-driven person. I have an engineering background. I've run 30 different companies, so I look at data. We don't just kind of willy-nilly flow things over. So I want to talk about the data. Now, COVID obviously threw a wrench into this data, but if you see the epoxy resin search term on Google in the United States here, it is generally leveled out. You had this big spike 2019, 2020, 2021. People were at home, people were taking up hobbies. Obviously a lot of people were posting on Instagram and social media. So you got that big spike in searches for epoxy resin, but you can see it's generally leveled out and been that way for the last few years. There's some seasonality to it. Obviously people aren't doing a lot of woodworking projects and stuff in the summer, so you got some little blips down there, but generally it is consistent. However, if you look at resin art, you'll see the same thing. You have that big kind of hump in 2019, 2020, maybe even 2021, again, leveled out. So that tells me that generally not a trend, that it's here to stay, like a lot of other crafting and other art forms. I mean, woodworking is certainly not going anywhere. And I think in general, probably half of what is being done with epoxy resin is combining it with wood to make hybrid wood and resin pieces, which I want to talk about in a second as well. But what you will see, this is an interesting one, is that river tables. I would say, river tables probably were more trendy than a long-term thing. I think anybody who looks at it from a design point of view knows that there are design trends that are cyclical, 10, 20 years, things go in and out of style. And I'm not sure anybody's going to want a giant, bright blue, resin wood dining table in their house for the next 20 years. However, I think that charcuterie boards, small format resin art, things like jewelry and dishes and turned bowls and all the other smaller format projects that use wood and resin are going to be here probably as long as live edge wood and woodworking in general are going to be around. In other words, for the foreseeable future. The data doesn't show otherwise. We don't see any big dips in this. We see that big dip in obviously the search for river tables, whereas it kind of was trendy, and now you can see it's trending downward. Now that's probably not just related to design style preferences, but also the physical cost. If you've ever made a large river table, the amount it costs in epoxy, the amount of time it takes to make one, and what they have to sell for. You can see some of those guys online like Cam at Blacktail Studios, and those guys out in Alberta, Black Forest Wood Co, I believe they are. I mean, their tables are $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, sometimes even more. The average person, even a wealthy person, isn't going to spend $30,000 on a kitchen or dining room table. So I think inherently, as the costs kind of, increase and the economy worsens and people are kind of worried about the state of the economy, they're not spending money on big river tables, but they will always spend money on the smaller format handmade artisan projects, which is, I think, a cool thing because that's what most of our customers make. That's generally what we sell into. You know, our molds aren't made for making 8-foot tables. You know, the largest silicone mold we have, I think, is a 48 by 24 by 2, if I'm not mistaken, and anything in between 0 and that. So I think it's just important to look at the data. Now, I want to talk about the people that are like the pro-environmental, anti-epoxy resin in general. I think there's obviously a lot of personal preference there. There's going to be some woodworkers that say, you know what, combining plastic with wood is a sin, and I can't change their mind. But I do want to say one thing, and this is probably something that you've heard before, but you know, pieces like this, you know, live edge wood in general used to be worth nothing. You know, there was no demand for it because if a mill couldn't take it and make it a nice, plain, clean, sanded piece of wood, it was thrown in the trash to burn or turned into sawdust wood chips, okay? So I want to address that, you know, the live edge wood that kind of started, you know, in the maybe late 80s, early 90s, becoming a thing with tables and, you know, chairs and different things made out of live edge, kind of saved a lot of that wood from the scrap pile, from being burnt and having the carbon sequestered in that wood, you know, put it back into the atmosphere. And I think kind of the same thing can be true today. There's going to be a lot of pieces of wood, a lot of live edge in particular, that gets used in these resin art projects that wouldn't be usable any other way. This, okay, you're not really going to make anything out of this. But if I put this in one of our molds and fill it with resin, it's going to be an absolute incredible piece. And that's what I'm actually going to do today. So one of my favorite things to do is actually find the craziest, wonkiest pieces of live edge wood, get them to a state where I can sort of put them in the mold. So like generally flat, this isn't perfectly flat, but generally flat, remove the bark with, you know, a bark removal knife or a draw knife like this guy, and get it ready, fill it with resin, and then finish it into a beautiful piece. That's something that really wouldn't have been practical or reasonable to do before the advent and the increase of popularity of epoxy resin. So I would just take that as it is. I think there's a lot to be said for, you know, caring for our environment. I'm just not sure when you think about the absolute insane amounts of pollution the oil companies and industry in general make, that small format crafts like this and using epoxy resin to turn useless pieces of wood into beautiful art that people are going to really enjoy and use in their home is a bad thing. My opinion, obviously I'm going to be a little bit biased because we sell this industry, but it also wouldn't be the end of the world for me if no one decided to make epoxy resin art anymore. I'd be just fine. So I just wanted to kind of put my 2 cents in there. Now, I also want to say that if you are new to epoxy resin, or maybe you want to kind of polish up your skills, we have an entire video series that I created a couple of years back. It's an 11-part video series. It's absolutely completely free. You don't have to pay for it. It kind of spills everything I know about making things out of epoxy and wood, going from like the tools you need, how to select the wood, where to find it, all the way to the finished, sanded, finished product. Okay, so it's an 11-part series. If you go to craftedelements.com/ERWBVS, epoxy resin wood basics video series, don't have that many fingers, you can sign up there and you'll get full access to that 11-part series, absolutely free. So if you want to learn more about making epoxy projects, knowing that if you learn how to do epoxy projects, it's probably going to be a craft, or at least a medium that's going to go and be pretty consistent into the future, go to craftedelements.com/ERWBVS. As a quick primer and reminder, we work a lot with Total Boat, which makes some epoxy resin for artists and woodworking, and of course marine, hence their name Total Boat. But they've got a series of resins that I want to just quickly go over here from left to right. We've got Maker Epoxy, which is a shallow pour product. It's generally a 1/4 inch. It's good for art resin, topping, putting a top coat on things. You know, is very, very good for suspending color and pigments in because it's very thick. It is not a resin that we were going to use for this because it's simply too thick. It's going to get too hot and it's going to ruin our piece. You need to select the right resin for the right job. So we're going to move up here, which is essentially more or less the same product. It's called a tabletop epoxy. It's more for taking live edge wood or resin art and wood pieces and doing a complete flood coat, self-leveling. It's going to give you a really nice hard shell of resin, anywhere from like an 1/8 to a 1/4 inch thick by the time it's done. So if you want to flood coat your pieces, that is a good option for you, and it sets up relatively quickly. And again, it's self-leveling. You've got your Total Boat thick set, which is kind of what I use most here in the shop, because most of the pieces that we use are kind of smaller format resin art, resin and wood pieces. It's good for pours up to 1 inch. Now, they always state the level of the height recommendation. So in this case, Total Boat thick set is 1 inch. I think Total Boat thick set fathom is good for 3 inches. But really, it's not a function of height, it's a function of volume. It's just most people don't understand volume or can really rationalize volume in their heads. But essentially, if I had a giant mold, a very, very giant mold that was 1 inch or 1.25 inches thick, and I filled it with this, it would get way too hot despite being in that 1 inch threshold, because it's simply a huge volume. So it's just a general recommendation, but you have to use your common sense. If you've got a big project that might be thin, you're probably going to want to go with something like Total Boat thick set fathom. It's going to generate way less heat. It's going to take longer to set, but you're not going to have the bubbling and the curling and stuff that you would get if you had a bad reaction from your epoxy generating too much heat and kind of going out of control. Now, in the case of this project, what I'm going to do is I've already taken our piece of wood. I don't even know what this is. It's not a hardwood. I don't think it's cedar. It's something in between. Unfortunately, I'm not an arborist, so I can't really tell you exactly what this is, but it is a very cool and funky piece of wood that's going to look absolutely beautiful and be very functional after we put it in one of our molds and drop some resin into it. And I'm going to use Total Boat's thick set fathom for this because we are 1.5 inches deep. It's basically 1.5 inches thick piece of wood. If this was thinner or this was a smaller mold, I'd probably would go with Total Boat thick set. And you can actually buy Total Boat products directly from Total Boat at totalboat.com. And of course, you can buy the molds, templates, and everything else you'll need at craftedelements.com from us. Now, I cover this in the Epoxy Resin and Wood Basics video series, but I've gone ahead and processed this piece of wood. It was covered in bark. I've taken the bark off. I've taken a chisel and I've chiseled out any of that raw or rot and kind of got it down to the, I don't want to say the heartwood, there's some sapwood left, but essentially the wood that is not going to come off. If you try and put your wood with bark and all that stuff into a mold and pour resin on it, that's eventually just going to detach because the resin is going to bond to the bark, and then the resin is going to get really heavy and it's going to snap right off. So you want to take all your bark off unless you're going to fully submerge this thing and let it all absorb in, which most people are not going to do. So I've already prepared this, like I said. I've trimmed it up to fit in this mold. This is one of our 18 by 18 by 1.5 inch deep molds. It's very, very heavy. This is not a cheap mold like anything else we make here at Crafted Elements, and it's not really comparable to the $20 or $30 molds you'll find on Amazon, and here's why. Okay, there's like 10 pounds of platinum cure silicone in here. These are not cheap to make, they're not cheap to buy, but they are a very high quality product that will last you quite a while if you take care of them. We have tens of thousands of customers that use these molds, so we've been doing this for a while. We have confidence in our products. I'm going to go ahead and switch the camera angle and get to utilizing some of this useless wood to make something beautiful. So like I said, I've got our 18 1.5 inch mold here. I've got our wood that we've pre-cut to already fit in that. And you can see that it's kind of protruding from the mold. It doesn't matter because remember, in the end, I'm going to have to run this through our planer or CNC machine or slab leveler or whatever anyway to level it all out. I don't plan on filling it up to that height. I plan on only filling it maybe to 1 inch, 1.25 inches. So at the end of this, most of this stuff's going to be gone anyway. I've kind of done the same thing over here. I've grabbed one of our molds. This wasn't like a planned project. This was just a spare piece of wood I had left over. I also had spare resin left over from our project. So in order to not waste either, I simply combine them. And what I can do once I have some more resin and backfill that, I can take this, I can use one of our templates here and actually make a really nice charcuterie board. Yes, I'm going to be having this and this wasted, but otherwise this entire section of resin and wood would have been wasted. So really this is just kind of going back to the whole proper and ethical use of wood and resin in terms of, adding to the plastic pollution or, our carbon footprint. Now, if you've been following Crafted Elements for a while, you know that any mold, not just our mold, needs a proper mold release. And there's a lot of reasons I can get into why you need this, but it comes down to protecting the surface of the mold from generally corrosive epoxy resin and also the heat that the resin generates. We find generally that the resin that takes much longer to set, like say Total Boat's thick set Fathom, is way less hard on silicone molds in general. So the first thing I'm going to do is give this a shake. I'm going to put my mask on and I'm going to give a nice spray and coat the entire inside of this mold to make sure all the surfaces are covered, and then I'll probably wait about 5 minutes just for it to dry out before I put the wood in there and then start measuring for our resin. Okay, so as I said before, that this wood is kind of wonky. It's not perfectly level, but the idea is once I fill this entire thing with resin, I'm going to weigh this down to make sure it doesn't float up in the resin. And any unlevel piece is going to be filled with resin anyway. And then once I run this through the planer, it's all going to be nice and pretty and level and flat. So I wouldn't worry too much about things like that. I'm just using a general kettlebell weight here, and that's sufficient to keep that held down. Now, in terms of estimating how much resin I'm going to need, the easiest way to do it is to just measure out the sections. So this is generally a triangle. It's 8 by 8, and then you know the depth is 1.5 inches if we were filling it all the way up to 1.5 inches. So I would come up with a cubic inch number, and I would add up all the volume in cubic inches, and then I go over to Google and say how many cubic inches or how many ounces is this many cubic inches. So for example, if I took this mold and it was empty, I'd have an 18 by 18 by 1.5 inches. So I'd multiply 18 by 18 by 1.5 inches. I'd come up with a cubic inch number. I'd multiply it by a factor, or again, just go to Google, enter that number, converted to ounces, and Google will spit out how many ounces I need. But in the case that we've actually used something like this, you can really just take the sum of these parts. And it doesn't have to be perfect. You know, I can see that this is 10 by maybe 2.5 by 1.5 inches. I'd come up with that as one section. This is another section. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure these all out, get a general estimate of how much resin I'm going to need in cubic inches. I'm going to add that all up, and then I'm going to convert it to ounces. Adding the sum of these up, I have 153 cubic inches. That's assuming that 1.5 inches of height, which I'm not going to use. I'm going to probably do 1.25 inches, but it ends up at 84 ounces. So if I take 153 cubic inches, throw it into Google and say how many ounces, it's 84 ounces. So knowing that I'm not going to use that full height, and again, adding some, 10% or so for air, I could probably make, 70 to 75 ounces and have enough to fill it up to the height I want. And the key is I'm going to use total boats thickset fathom because it is a higher volume, but I'm going to actually only tint it mildly because I want to be able to see all this character, because that's one of the cool things about this piece of wood is that you've got this void here. It looks kind of like a pond or like a valley. I want to make sure I see that. So I don't want to completely make this tinted and opaque. And possibly one of the most important things about mixing resin is making sure you've got your ratios right. Every resin will have a different mix ratio. Generally, the art resins are like a 1-to-1, so the thicker resins are 1-to-1, but Total Bolt thickset is a 2-to-1, and the smaller number is always the hardener. So in this case, I've got part B, the hardener. For one part of this, I'm going to have 2 parts of this. So for example, to keep things simple, if I was making 300 ounces, I would use 200 ounces of A and 100 ounces of B. Now in my case, I think I estimated like 75 ounces I need. So I would take 3 parts total, which is 2 plus 1. 75 divided by 3 is 25 ounces. So 24 ounces for every part. So I'm going to need 25 ounces of hardener, and I'm going to need 50 ounces of resin. Does that make sense? 75 ounces total into 3 parts. So I'm going to go ahead and put my hardener in, approximately 25 ounces of hardener. Now I don't have a 24-ounce mark on this bucket, but I've got a 16 and I've got a 32, and obviously halfway in between is 24. So, and then I'm going to use my resin, and I'm going to add 50, or at least bring that up to roughly 75 ounces. Same deal, I don't have a 75 ounce mark, but I've got a 64 and an 80, so I can kind of use a gradient and determine where approximately 75 ounces is there. Stir stick, and you really just want to do this gently. It's not as important with the very thin, low viscosity resins like Total Bolt 6 at Fathom. It's more water-like than gel-like, whereas Total Boat's Maker Epoxy or Tabletop is very, very thick, so you can't be aggressive in mixing that because it'll introduce a lot of bubbles. So I'm going to go and mix this until it's a homogeneous mixture, and that just means that until it's clear, like until all these little lines and stuff you see are gone, and we have like a relatively clear solution. So whether that takes 2 minutes or 3 minutes, it really depends on how fast you're mixing. You can also use a power mixer, like on a drill, but that's going to have the tendency to introduce more bubbles, which generally will degas themselves, or you might have to put into a degassing or a vacuum chamber to suck out the air that you've introduced. But if you can do this gently and stir it gently, you're going to be better off. All right, let's talk about colorants or pigments. Sorry about the cable that's in the way for our little CNC machine here. I've got an entire wall, as you can see, of pigments by Black Diamond. They're generally the most popular amongst resin artists, and they have a bajillion colors. Maybe not a bajillion, but it's certainly a lot of colors. And they've got this, which they provided to us. We built the shelf, they provided the pigments. And I can pretty much select any color I want. Now the difference is, generally with these pigments, is they are like a pearl or an iridescent pigment. So they've got mica powder or faux mica powder in them to give you that pearlescent look. So it really depends on what you're going for. If I'm going to use this in my mix, I'm going to want to use just a little bit of it to tint it. I'm going to have some floating pearlescent pieces, but I'm still going to want to be able to see through that. Whereas if I really wanted to make it transparent, I could use something like an alcohol ink pigment, like Pinata Colors by, what is this, Jacquard. So they've got alcohol ink pigments. Total Boat also uses, I think the Mixol pigments, which is Total Boat's pigment dispersion. And these are like paste pigments that will give you a solid opaque color, or you just use less of it to get a translucent color, but they do not have like a pearl effect to them, but they're extremely powerful. You can use like almost like just a tiny little drop of this in that big bucket of resin and have really good color coverage. And that's more of a trial and error thing. As you get familiar with this and do it over time, you'll figure out how much pigment you need to get the effect that you want. In my case, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to mix. I'm going to use my Pinata Baja Blue to generally tint the blue, and I'm going to grab maybe Bora Bora Blue, which is a very similar kind of color from Black Diamond, to give me a little bit of a pearlescent effect. I'll show you here with this Pinata color just how insanely powerful this stuff can be. A few drops here, and mixing it up. A nice, thorough, tinted blue resin. Kind of like a water-like color, which is what I'm going for. Whereas if I take a little bit of this, and I could do this with a measuring device, or I could just tap that in there. Got a little bit of a deeper blue, and then I've got the suspension of those mica particles in the resin. All right, it's relatively simple now. Got the wood in there, I've got our weight on, got the mold release sprayed in advance, and I'm really just going to pour this in and let it fill up. And again, hoping that if my calculations were somewhat accurate, I'm going to end up filling it up about 3/4 or a little past 3/4 of the way. To the top of the mold, that is. I think once that levels out, I should probably have the height that I wanted. Because right now this is about 1.5 inches, this is about 1 inch. By the time all the resin flows everywhere, you're probably going to end up at that 1.25 inches, 1.125 inches, which is kind of what I was targeting. So the main disadvantage of the thinner resin products like Total Boat Stick Set Fathom is the set time. This is going to take 3 or 4 days before I can remove it from the mold, and then probably another couple more days before that, before I actually want to cut it and flatten it and level it and sand it. If you take it out of the mold and it seems kind of ready, it might not be. You want it to be cured before you go ahead and sand it, otherwise it's just going to gum up your sandpaper, and you'll tell. You'll be able to tell, like once you start sanding it or cutting it, it's kind of gummy instead of like a dust or like a finer powder. That means it's not fully set yet. So we're going to leave this here on the desk for like 3 or 4 days. I'm going to come back, we're going to demold it, trim it, plane it, sand it, finish it, and you'll see how we turn this generally useless piece of wood into something very, very cool. Okay, we are back. So, I don't know, 5 days later. We've had enough time for our Total Boat Thick Set Fathom resin to dry, and it is now super hard, and it is ready to come out of this mold. And you can see the beauty of these guys is just that, oh, it just comes out so easily. You get that noise, and you got that nice clean mold that you can just quickly wash, spray down with mold release, and give it a go again. And we'll just demold this one, which I did on the side. I didn't really film this when I was making it, but same deal. Some spare wood that I had here in the shop. Put some seashells in there, and some Total Boat Thick Set, not Fathom in this case, because it's about 1 inch. Again, we got a mold ready for future use. This I'm not going to demold because it still needs a top coat of resin. But the point of this video was how I'm using these molds and like intermittently, you know, grabbing random funky pieces of wood that are just left over in the shop from projects or completely useless pieces of wood like this guy, and making something cool out of it. Now, I'm going to finish the video by finishing this project. What I'm going to do here is, I mean, this could technically be a big serving board, like a big tray, or it could be even a small tabletop, like an end table. But I think what I'm going to do is, to get kind of the most functionality of it, is my wife saw it and she wants to donate these some charcuterie boards to like a cheer thing that my daughter does. So I'm going to go ahead and actually cut this right down the middle. So I'm going to cut it in half, and I'm going to finish both these as two 18 by roughly 9-inch charcuterie boards. So follow me as I do that. The first thing we're going to do is obviously cut this on our table saw. Obviously our wood and our resin are not anywhere near the same level, so we're going to have to run it through our planer. Now, if I wanted to keep this piece intact, I couldn't use my shop planer because that thing's only good for 12 inches. I'd have to use one of our CNCs. We've got a little one here. We've got a very big one, 3 doors down or 2 doors down. But again, I'm not going to need either of those because I'm going to use my shop planer once I cut this in half, and then we'll proceed to finish it from there. So after running these boards through the planer, I brought it over to the drum sander. I got an initial sand done. It basically just prevents me from having to do it initially with my palm sander. Obviously, if you don't have a drum sander, which most people don't, you know, palm sander is fine. Just process takes a little bit longer. I have the tool, might as well use it. And then I brought these over a few doors down to one of our processing areas, and I used our, I think it's a 1/4 inch, it might be a 3/8 round over bit or chamfer bit, and I just put a nice rounded edge on all perimeters of these boards. So the very last thing to do at this point is just go from 120 grit to whatever grit you want, depending on the level of sheen and polish in the epoxy you want, and then apply the finish. That's literally the rest of the process here. Now, in the case of these guys, I can pretty much get away with going to maybe 320 grit because I don't need perfect clarity. But with these ones that I did when I made off camera that have the shells in them, you're probably going to want to go a little bit higher to get the clarity in that resin out of it, probably up to 2,000, maybe even 3,000 grit. The thing to remember is that you really don't want to sand your wood to 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 grit, because then your finish won't absorb very well into it. So what I typically recommend is you can sand the entire thing to that higher grit, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, whatever it is, and then you go back over your wood with maybe 120 grit or 180 grit sandpaper, just the wood area, avoiding the epoxy resin, to make sure it's rough enough and that the pores are open enough that your finish, whether it be, you know, like a standard mineral oil finish or Total Boat's, you know, wood honey, or, you know, Odie's oil, or whatever you're using for your finish, absorbs into the wood. Cool? So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. I'm not going to make you watch hours of sanding. We're going to fast forward through this process where we've got these pretty much ready to apply a coat to. I've gone through a couple iterations of sanding, and what you'll always find, especially with epoxy and some of this crazy wood, which has a lot of voids, is you'll get like bubbles and things that pop. You know, we've planed this down, we've exposed different other edges that weren't exposed to the epoxy. So the easiest way to fix this is you can either pour epoxy in there and, you know, wait a day, like use a fastening epoxy, but I prefer to use something like Total Boat's Total Bond and the activator. It's essentially, it's CA glue or super glue essentially. And you can basically dab it into those holes and spray the applicator, and it'll harden really quick so you can sand it right away. The cool thing is you can also tint this. So if you put this in a little cup first, you can add pigment or whatever to match if you wanted to match your resin, and then take that and put it in here. I don't really care about, you know, using the blue color for this. I'm just going to go ahead and fill it in here. And I believe they make this in like 3 different thicknesses. This is thick, then there's also a medium, and I believe there is a thin, like a water thin type thickness, which would each one has their own kind of application. I prefer the thick stuff, it's just easier to use. So I'm going to go ahead and just apply this to all those voids and kind of open areas that we've exposed in the wood here. And once I can spray the hardener on that, the accelerator on that, it'll harden it up. And then I can go ahead and sand it down. And this stuff will eventually harden by itself without the accelerator, but this just makes your job a little more efficient, a little easier. All right, we'll give it a few minutes to fully dry, and then we can come back and start sanding it again. Okay, we are at the end of the line here, guys. I've done this up to 180 on the wood and 320 on the resin, and then these guys, same thing, 180 on the wood and I believe 1500 on the resin, because I do want this to be a little bit clearer. And normally what I would do at this point is just blow them off, which I did, gets all the dust off, and then apply our finish. Now, my finish of choice that I pretty much use for every charcuterie board and sort of food grade wood project here is Total Boat's Wood Honey. But this is all I have left. It would definitely do these 4 boards, but I just don't want to use it all right now. I'll get some more from Total Boat, but this stuff is great. I'm just not going to use it today. I'm going to use this guy, which is just like big bulk Howard cutting board oil. It does a good job. It definitely looks cool when you apply it, especially when it pools, and I'll show you that in a second. It's just not as great in terms of longevity as something like the Total Boat Wood Honey is. But without further ado, here's the ASMR version. I'm going to put these puddles here, and you can see the clarity just go wow, right? It just turns to glass, especially with the resin once it hits the resin, right? Now this stuff I'm going to take and just rub all over the boards with my hands, which have obviously gloves on them. I wouldn't do this with your bare hands, although it probably wouldn't hurt you. And then what we're going to do is we're going to leave this for at least 10 to 20 minutes, because this is just a food grade mineral oil. That's all we're using here. And we want to make sure that it has enough time to absorb into the wood. It won't absorb into the resin. It'll fill any sort of pinholes and pores in the resin, but it won't actually absorb into the plastic like it will the wood. It'll actually physically absorb into this. All right, we're gonna let these chill out here for a little bit. I will come back and buff them off, and then we can see the final product. So I'm just giving these boards the final rub down, getting rid of all that excess oil, and just kind of doing a hand buffing. And you can see it looks very, very cool. I think part of that appeal with these boards in particular is using that really funky, kind of useless, piece of wood. You got a lot of character there. You've got this little lagoon in there, so to speak. Just using a plain, live edge piece of walnut without a lot of character kind of make for a boring board in that case. So yeah, I think that this video is a good demonstration on how you can use kind of the wonkiest, wackiest, most gnarly pieces of live edge you can find to make very cool, extra beautiful boards that are going to stand out as gifts, or if you're selling them in the market, then they'll stand out that way as well. A couple of takeaways from this video. If you enjoyed watching it and you found what I say and teach useful, I have an entire video series, zero cost. This is not one of those like, oh, it's an upsell of this. No, it's zero cost. Okay, guys? We want to teach you guys how to make this stuff so you have an option to use our products. It's very simple. If you go to craftedelements.com/video craftedelements.com/ERWBVS. That's craftedelements.com/ERWBVS. That'll get you access to the Epoxy Resin Wood Basics video series. It's an 11-part video module, completely free, as I said, and it'll teach you everything from what tools you need, how to select the wood, how to select the resin, how to select the molds, all that kind of stuff. How to finish these boards, how to sand them, and all those considerations. It's covered in that video series. Now, if you're looking to buy some of the resin, then you'll want to head over to totalboat.com. They're one of our partners. They provide all of our resin here in the shop, as well as our Total Boat Wood Honey, which is a very cool finished product that I didn't use on this, but I would have if I had more. And of course, if you're looking to get some very big molds, templates, router templates, jigs, router sleds for making really big projects without a CNC machine, then craftedelements.com is where you would find that stuff. We are the largest provider of woodworking molds and router templates in the universe. Well, I'd like to say in the universe, I don't know, maybe there's someone else out there that does a better job than us, but I can tell you we sell a lot of molds and templates and we have a very, very high reputation. You can definitely check that out at craftedelements.com. Click on the reviews section of our site to see that I'm not just joking about that. Okay guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions or comments, please of course post them below. And if you found it useful and you liked it, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button if you want to see more videos like this, because I'm always doing project videos using our products and just generally creating some content for tips and tricks on how to scale your business as a woodworker. All right guys, thanks for watching and happy making.